Hey, there you are. I see you. Yes, I do. I know you're thinking this is just some animated thing at the start of this video, but no, I'm here. And I see you listening. So, don't you click away, because this one is special. I know you're a fan of the post-apocalypse zombie horror genre, and this one is exactly what you are looking for. So, yes, time for you to... I haven't done this in a while, have I? It's time for you to sit back and relax with your favorite drink and listen to Surviving the Undead by Margot Holloway. Part 1. Psychosis of Survival. Ashwood used to be a lively little town. Now it was just empty, silent and rotting. The streets hadn't seen real life in ages, just the dragging footsteps of the undead. Days still passed, but it was like time itself had given up. The sun set over crumbling buildings that nature was slowly reclaiming, casting shadows that looked like ghosts of what used to be. The air stank of decay, and the silence was the worst part, thick, unnatural. Every now and then a low moan would cut through, a reminder that we weren't as alone as we might have hoped. A group of 5 survivors picked their way through the wreckage, moving carefully like they'd done it 100 times before. At the front was Alice, who used to be a nurse, back when hospitals were still a thing. Her steady hands hadn't changed, but the warmth in her eyes had. She scanned every alley, every broken window with the kind of calm that only comes from living through constant fear. Her white blouse, once clean, was now streaked with dirt and sweat, a grim reminder of everything she'd had to leave behind. Not long ago, she'd worn scrubs. That felt like another life. Mark followed behind her, sharp and alert. He moved like a soldier. That's exactly what he used to be. His eyes darted everywhere, never still, never trusting. The steel was still there in his posture, but the exhaustion hung just as heavy now. The scars on his face weren't just physical. You could see the history in them, the lives he hadn't managed to save. And there was Jenny, just a kid really, 16 maybe, but already too used to the way this world worked. Her expression didn't give much away, but her eyes said enough. Grief lived there, deep and quiet. She clutched a makeshift weapon, a pipe wrapped in duct tape, like it was her only tether to staying alive. Paul brought up the rear, tall and awkward, lost in his own head as usual. He was a science guy, always muttering about chemicals and cures, trying to piece together some kind of fix for whatever had started all this. Revenant P, he called it. Most of the time, he seemed more comfortable with formulas than with people. Still, his brain might be the only reason any of us had made it this far. And Rachel. Rachel was a mess of raw nerves and emotion. Her energy was constant, frantic really, and her eyes were always red. She kept a photo with her of her son, worn and nearly falling apart. We all knew her hope was a double-edged sword. It kept her moving, but it also made her unpredictable. They moved through an old grocery store, picking through whatever was left. The shelves were mostly empty, stripped bare by others before them, but they searched anyway. Alice gave quiet hand signals to keep things organized, and no one spoke unless they had to. Here and there they found scraps, a can of beans, half a bottle of water. Nothing amazing, but enough to keep going. Then Mark found something real, a small stash of medical supplies hidden behind a broken display. "Alice, over here," he whispered, holding up a first aid kit. She actually smiled, just for a second, but still, it was something. Near the front, Jenny froze at the window. Blood smears streaked the cracked glass. And outside, a lone zombie staggered past. "They're getting closer," she murmured, tightening her grip on the pipe. Paul didn't look up. "We should go. This place isn't safe." Rachel pulled a toy from a pile of debris. A kid's thing, maybe left behind in a panic. She held it for a second, eyes wet again, and then forced herself to move. "Keep looking. There could be more." They grabbed what they could and prepared to leave. The trust between them was thin, held together more by survival than anything else. As they stepped back into the fading light, that familiar weight returned. The undead were out there, but the real danger might be in the cracks forming between them. But still they moved as one. Barely, because in Ashwood, surviving the dead was only part of the fight. The real test was surviving each other and themselves. The grocery store raid had been a rare success, but dusk was closing in fast, dragging those long shadows over the dead town of Ashwood. Time was no longer a luxury. The group moved swiftly through the streets, footsteps hushed against the fractured pavement, every sound amplified in the heavy silence. Only the occasional distant moan pierced the stillness, that chilling reminder of what lurked in the periphery. As they turned into a narrow alley that cut between two forgotten buildings, the atmosphere changed. The air seemed denser, heavier somehow. Then a deep, muffled groan reverberated off the alley walls, low and guttural. Jenny's grip tightened on her pipe. Mark halted mid-step, his arm snapping up in warning. Alice's pulse surged as her eyes swept the shadows. "We need to move," she hissed. "Now." Too late. From behind a row of abandoned cars, a horde surged into view, limping, shuffling, snarling. Decay hung off their bones in loose strips, their eyes glassy and lifeless, fixed on the living with feral hunger. "Run!" Mark barked, shoving Paul forward as the creatures gave chase. The alley echoed with the thunder of desperate feet and ragged breathing. Alice led them through a tight gap between two buildings, the walls brushing their shoulders as they squeezed through. Behind them, the sound of scraping nails and guttural moans grew louder. Rachel tripped, panic spilling across her face. "This way," she cried, pointing toward a side street. Then she turned to look back and froze. Among the horde, a small figure shuffled forward. A child, arms limp at his sides, his blue jacket streaked with filth. Her heart seized. "Jake?" The name escaped her lips, barely audible. "Rachel, move!" Alice roared, yanking her forward. But Rachel resisted, sobbing now, eyes locked on the small zombie in the jacket. "That was him. I saw him. My son, he's there." Mark and Jenny flanked her, dragging her along as the group burst from the alley into an open intersection, the infected hard on their heels. Adrenaline propelled them forward, every step driven by instinct and terror. The whole town blurred around them, a wasteland of memory and rot. At last, the safe house loomed, an abandoned building fortified with scrap and prayer. They threw themselves inside, slamming the door shut just as the first bodies thudded against it. Barricades were shoved into place, hands shaking, hearts racing. The moans outside rose to a fever pitch. "God, we can't stay here," Paul panted, his face bleached with fear. "They know we're here now. They won't stop." Alice nodded, already planning. "Yeah, we need another shelter, somewhere they won't follow." Rachel collapsed onto the floor, cradling the child's toy she'd found earlier, sobs racking her body. "He was there," she whispered. "My Jake. I saw him." Alice knelt beside her, her voice low but firm. "Rachel, I know it hurts, but if we don't survive, we can't help anyone, not even Jake." Mark and Jenny moved fast, stuffing what supplies they could into their packs. "Right, there's an old cabin out past the ridge," Mark said. "It's isolated. We can get there before nightfall, if we hurry." Alice helped Rachel to her feet, her eyes soft but urgent. "We'll find him. But not tonight, not like this." Then they slipped back into the streets, leaving the compromised safe house behind. As they neared the tree line on Ashwood's edge, the forest greeted them with long, whispering shadows. Each step into the woods was a step deeper into uncertainty. And though the horde had been left behind for now, their real enemy had followed. Grief, paranoia, desperation. The rot of the world was no longer confined to the corpses. It had begun to spread through the minds of the living. The forest pressed in around them like it was a living thing itself, its skeletal trees clawing at the night sky. Cold air bit at their skin as the group pushed through tangled undergrowth, every breath visible in the gloom. The memory of the horde's relentless pursuit still clung to them like smoke, its echoes lodged in their bones. But there was no time to dwell. Shelter was no longer a comfort. It was a matter of survival. After what felt like a lifetime, they came upon a cabin, half swallowed by undergrowth, its roof sagging beneath years of neglect. It looked forgotten. Well, forgotten enough to be safe, maybe. Mark raised a hand. "Right, I'll check it out," he said, his voice barely audible. He moved like a shadow toward the structure. Oh, the weight was suffocating. Then a signal. Thumbs up. "It's clear," he confirmed. "We can use it." Relief didn't come easily anymore, but it stirred faintly in their chests as they stepped inside. Dust coated everything like ash, and the air smelled of old wood and mold. But it was 4 walls and a roof, and that had to be enough. They worked in silence, barricading doors and windows with whatever they could find. Furniture, planks, even broken shelving. Outside, the darkness pressed closer, thick with unseen threats. Inside, tensions simmered. Rachel paced like a caged animal, the battered toy clutched to her chest. Her eyes were wide and haunted. We need to go back," she said again. "We can't leave Jake out there." Alice, crouched beside Mark and tending to his injuries, didn't look up. "Rachel, we've been through this. We can't risk all our lives chasing a ghost." Rachel's face twisted. She turned away, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Jenny sat hunched in a corner, cleaning her nails with trembling fingers, her face pale and drawn. It was a nervous habit, one of the few she had left. Then a sudden noise broke the tension. "Hey, check this out," Paul called from the back of the cabin, holding up a small, dusty box. "Medical supplies, bandages, antiseptic, even antibiotics." Alice crossed the room quickly, her eyes lighting up with the first real hope in several hours. This could save someone's life. As she cleaned the gash on Mark's arm, he winced. "We can't stay here long. They will find us." "I know," Alice replied, her voice soft but steady. "But tonight we rest, regroup, and tomorrow we move." Night deepened. Around a sputtering fire fed by scraps in an old stove, the group huddled together. Shadows danced on the cabin walls, twisting, warping, feeding their unease. Rachel sat apart, her gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the room. "I can't sit here doing nothing," she whispered. "Jake's out there. He needs me." Alice stared into the flames. "Rachel, I know this is tearing you apart, but if you go out there alone, you die. None of us can afford that." "You don't know," Rachel hissed, turning on her. "None of you do." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Jenny stood abruptly, her face stricken. "We're all going to die out there," she blurted, "one by one." "Jenny," Alice started, reaching for her. "Don't touch me," Jenny recoiled, panic in her voice. "I don't want to end up like them." Paul tried to calm her. "We're not dead yet. Not if we stick together." She sank to the floor, hugging her knees. "I just want this nightmare to stop." The fire cracked and hissed. The cabin felt smaller now, colder. Alice exchanged a grim glance with Mark. Yes, the seams were coming undone. We need a plan, she said finally, her voice steady. First light we scout. Supplies, signs of life, or anything. We don't stop moving. There were murmurs of agreement, hollow and tired. No one dared to hope too loudly any more. As the fire dimmed and the forest whispered outside, it became clear. The zombies weren't the only threat. The true danger did now fester within. Doubt, grief, guilt, and the slow fraying of the mind. And yet still, somewhere out there in the dark, the undead stirred. Waiting. The moon spilled a cold, ghostly light over the forest, painting the undergrowth in silver and shadow. The cabin stood deathly still, disturbed only by the occasional creak of tired wood and the distant, mournful wails of the undead. Mark kept vigil at the window, eyes locked on the tree line, every muscle taut with the strain of anticipation. Footsteps, light and careful, signaled Alice's approach. "Hey, how's the arm?" she asked softly, her voice barely more than a breath, careful not to disturb the uneasy sleep of those behind them. Mark flexed the limb, wincing slightly beneath the fresh bandages. "It's better, thanks to you." They stood together in the silence, a silence thick with the weight of everything unspoken, grief, exhaustion, guilt, and so much more. After a long moment, Mark exhaled slowly. "I've been thinking about before all this, about the things I've done." Alice turned toward him, reading the haunted flicker behind his eyes. "You don't have to explain." He shook his head. "I want to. I was in the military. Did missions, classified stuff. Not all of it clean. I made calls that got people killed. Sometimes I still see their faces." His voice dropped to a rasp. "It doesn't go away." Alice placed a hand gently on his shoulder then. "You're not alone in that, Mark. We've all got ghosts now. But you're still here, fighting to protect the people who are left. That counts for something." He looked at her then, something raw and real in his gaze. "I don't know what I'd do without you." For a fleeting moment the world fell away, the horrors outside, the blood on their hands, and there was only this. Two people finding comfort in a world that had none left to give. Mark's hand closed around hers, and a silent promise passed between them. But the moment shattered. A noise from the back room, the unmistakable rustle of movement. They spun around, and Rachel's bedroll was empty. "Oh, damn it," Mark hissed, already grabbing his weapon. "She's gone." Alice's heart kicked into overdrive. "Right, we need to move fast." They roused Jenny and Paul with hushed urgency. Jenny's face went pale, fingers tightening around her makeshift weapon. Paul, still pale and weakened, insisted on coming. They plunged into the woods, tracing Rachel's frantic footprints. The forest groaned with the unsettling noises of the undead, soft, wet snarls just out of sight, but the group pressed forward, spurred by dread. Eventually voices, human voices, cut through the darkness. Mark raised a hand, signaling a halt. They crouched at the edge of a clearing where Rachel stood arguing with a group of strangers. 4 of them, armed, angry. "Please," Rachel begged, voice cracked with desperation. "I'm just looking for my son." A man stepped forward, big and broad, with a jagged scar slicing across his cheek. "Not our problem," he spat. "Turn around now, before we make this your last mistake." Mark stepped out of the shadows, weapon drawn and ready. "Let her go. We don't want trouble." The man turned, eyes narrowing. "Who the hell are you supposed to be?" Tension snapped like a wire. One of the strangers lunged for Rachel, and Mark didn't hesitate. A shot rang out, and chaos exploded across the clearing. Bullets cracked through trees, shots tore through the night. In the confusion, Paul went down with a gasp, blood blooming from his side like spilled ink. "Paul!" Alice cried, dropping to her knees beside him, hands already soaked red as she tried to stop the bleeding. The fight ended in minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. The strangers scattered into the woods, their retreat leaving only bruises, blood, and a broken group behind. Rachel stood trembling, her face hollow with shock. I didn't mean to... Mark rounded on her, fury barely contained. You could have gotten us all killed. They carried Paul back through the woods, his groans fading with every step. Back at the cabin, the walls seemed to close in even tighter, and the silence was heavier than before. Tension, once simmering, now boiled just beneath the surface. Alice worked feverishly to save Paul, refusing to let the worst happen. The others sat motionless, each of them unraveling quietly in their own way. Rachel kept to the corner, eyes vacant, her presence a crack in the group's fragile unity. Mark paced like a caged animal, while Jenny sat at the door, metal pipe across her knees, staring at nothing. Well, they'd survived another night, but at a cost. And the truth was now impossible to ignore. The real threat wasn't just the undead pressing in from the forest. It was them. And the slow, steady collapse of their trust in one another had truly begun. Paul's condition was deteriorating fast. His groans came in shallow bursts, each breath sounding closer to the end. Blood seeped through Alice's fingers as she and Mark gently lowered him onto the makeshift bed. Her hands moved with practiced urgency, but her pulse thundered in her ears. "Hold on, Paul," she whispered, voice cracking as she fumbled through the battered first aid kit. Gauze, thread, painkillers. Not enough. Never enough. Mark stood sentry at the window, his silhouette tense against the pale moonlight, rifle clutched in hands that had seen too much. He scanned the tree line, jaw clenched, eyes burning holes into the darkness. In the corner, Rachel sat curled in on herself, arms wrapped around her legs like a child trying to vanish. Her face was a portrait of guilt, lips trembling, eyes vacant. Jenny stood nearby, clutching her metal pipe with white-knuckled desperation, looking younger than ever. Then a sound, a twig, sharp and deliberate, cracking underfoot. Everyone froze. Mark's eyes snapped toward the sound. He raised his hand slowly. Silence fell around them like a shroud. More sounds. Voices now. Low, angry, getting closer. "They're here," Mark muttered, cold and grim. "They tracked us." Alice met his gaze, her expression hardening. She handed Jenny a knife, placing it gently into the girl's shaking hands. "Right, stay close to me." And then the door exploded open. The hostile survivors stormed in with rage on their faces and weapons drawn. The man with the scar led the charge, eyes locked on Mark. "This is your last mistake," he snarled, and then fired. Gunfire shattered the air, and the cabin became a war zone. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness in strobe-like bursts. Mark returned fire, ducking and weaving. Alice threw herself over Paul's body, shielding him as best she could. Jenny screamed, swinging her pipe wildly, while Rachel cowered, paralyzed. None of them noticed what was coming next. Drawn by the noise, the dead were closing in. First just a few, then more, Dozens. Their snarls grew louder, their hunger sharpening like knives in the dark. And then the windows burst. Rotting hands clawed through the broken glass, grotesque faces pressed against the walls. The undead flooded in, overwhelming the space like a tidal wave of death. The hostile group turned their weapons on them, but panic set in too fast. Jenny screamed as a corpse lunged and dragged her down. Alice tried to reach her. God, she tried, but it was too late. Jenny's scream cut off like a snapped wire. Gone. Alice froze, eyes wide in horror. A part of her broke right there and then. Rachel fought back with a primal, hopeless fury, but the horde swallowed her too, her last breath a choked whisper of her son's name. Only Mark and Alice remained now, fighting back to back, soaked in blood, every breath a struggle. Their bond had been forged through fear and survival, and was the only thing holding them together. But the cabin was gone. It had been totally overrun. "Paul!" Alice shouted above the chaos. "We have to move!" Mark didn't hesitate. Together they lifted Paul, barely conscious, a limp weight between them, and barreled through the front door, pushing through blood, bone, and smoke. Behind them the others were lost. The dead now hunted only them. And so they ran. Branches tore at their skin. The forest was a blur of shadow and pain. The groans behind them faded but never disappeared. Finally they reached a clearing, and their legs gave out. They collapsed. Paul was barely alive, skin deathly pale, drenched in cold sweat. Alice pressed her hands to his chest, whispering frantic prayers and doing what little she could. Mark knelt beside her, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on hers, fierce yet exhausted. "We can't stay here," he said. "If we stop moving, we die." Tears streamed down Alice's cheeks as she nodded. "We'll find a way. We have to." The night swallowed them again. Quiet now, but not still. The silence left behind was filled with grief, ghosts, and a fragile thread of hope. They'd lost almost everything. Rachel, Jenny, the last illusion of safety. But they had each other, and sometimes in a world like this, that was the only thing left worth fighting for. The barn loomed in the early morning haze like a ghost from another life, its sagging frame and rusted roof whispering of a world that no longer existed. Time had worn it down, but it still stood, weathered and stubborn, offering a sliver of shelter to those who had nowhere else to go. Alice and Mark reached it with Paul slung between them, the man's weight deadened by unconsciousness and blood loss. They forced the heavy doors open with a groan of ancient hinges, and the scent of old hay, dust, and rotting timber enveloped them like a blanket. Inside it was still and dim. Light filtered through cracks in the wood, slicing through the air in golden beams. Well, it wasn't safe, but it was enough for now. They laid Paul gently into a pile of straw, his breath shallow, skin cold. But he was alive, and that was all that mattered. Then, without ceremony, Alice and Mark collapsed beside him, their bodies drained, their minds echoing with screams and fire and the last moments of the people they'd loved and lost. Jenny's terrified eyes, Rachel's final cry. The silence stretched, broke only by the faint rustling of leaves and the far-off groans of the undead, reminders that the world outside was still hunting them. Mark leaned back against the splintered wall, eyes closed, jaw tight. Alice hovered over Paul, checking his bandages with shaking hands. Blood had dried on her palms. That had started to feel normal. Eventually sleep pulled at them, uneasy, shallow, broken by twitching limbs and ghosts in the shadows. A low moan snapped Alice awake. She rushed to Paul's side. "Paul," she breathed, brushing damp hair from his forehead. Can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, and a soft groan escaped his lips. "Alice, Mark." His voice was threadbare, but behind the pain, his mind was clear. "I'm sorry," he said, every word a battle. "For everything." Mark stirred, crawling closer. "Don't say that. You're still with us. That's what matters now." Paul coughed, then winced, his gaze sharpening. "Before everything went to hell, I heard rumors. A place, a safe zone, something left behind. Military, maybe government. North of here, near the old base in the mountains." Alice's heart skipped, her breath caught in her throat. You sure?" she asked, trying to mask the desperation in her voice. "I don't know if it's still there," Paul murmured, "but it's our best shot. If it exists, it's a chance." Mark looked at Alice, something flickering in his eyes. Something rare now. Hope. "Well, it's a lead," he said. "We need to try." Alice nodded, steel rising in her spine. "Well, we can't stay here. We head for the mountains. If there's even a chance we can find safety, we'll take it." The rest of the day passed in a quiet rhythm of preparation. They took stock. Half a bottle of water, a few cans of food from the wreckage of the cabin, scraps of gauze and antibiotics. Not nearly enough. But it'd have to be. As the sun set and the shadows deepened, the barn took on a haunted silence. They braced the doors with old planks, tied them shut with frayed rope, knowing it would not hold forever. That night they sat in a circle, eating in silence, their breaths fogging in the cold. The weight of loss hung heavy in the air. Jenny's laugh, Rachel's defiance, all gone. But Paul's story gave them something precious. Direction. He spoke more clearly now, describing the facility he'd heard about. Underground bunkers, emergency stockpiles, maybe even other survivors. Alice listened, holding on to every word like it was a lifeline. Dawn crept in through the barn's fractured walls, a thin light breaking the dark. Alice and Mark moved with quiet efficiency. Using old boards, rope, and a torn tarp, they fashioned a crude stretcher for Paul. And it wasn't elegant, but it'd work. Before they left, they knelt beside the place where they'd slept and whispered names into the silence. Jenny. Rachel. They didn't have graves, but they had memories, and that would have to be enough. Outside, the world was cold and still. The forest stretched ahead, and beyond it, the mountains loomed like jagged teeth against the sky. Alice and Mark hoisted the stretcher. Oh, every step was a trial. But they moved forward, north, toward the hope of something better, toward a place untouched, maybe, by the rot and ruin. They didn't look back. They couldn't. Their journey wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about redemption, about honoring the dead, about finding something worth living for in a world that had forgotten how. And as they disappeared into the trees, the barn faded behind them. Just another ruin in a dying world, but one that had given them a moment to breathe, to remember, and to believe. As the first light of dawn spilled through the trees, casting long pale beams across the mossy earth, Alice contemplated her one last sweep of the barn. They'd been nearly ready to move, but instinct, or maybe something deeper, had told her to check again, just in case. In the far corner, half buried beneath a forgotten pile of rags and straw, she'd spotted something. She crouched down and pulled it free, a small leather-bound journal that had somehow been among their meager supplies. The cover was cracked and stained, the pages yellowed at the edges. Rachel's name was written faintly on the inside flap. Now that they were taking a short break in their journey, Alice hesitated, but then flipped it open. Page after page filled with Rachel's handwriting. The early entries were almost too much to read. Lines dripping with grief, hope, and raw desperation. She wrote about her son, Jake, about dreams of rescue, about trying to stay sane while the world tore itself apart. But further in, something shifted. The tone darkened. March 12th. I've been watching Paul. He's always muttering to himself, scribbling notes, hiding things. He thinks we don't notice, but I do. He watches us like we're test subjects, not people. I don't know what he's doing, but it doesn't feel right. March 19th. Oh, Paul's getting worse. He keeps going on about a cure, but there's something wrong in his eyes, like he's not really here anymore. Last night I caught him with a syringe. He got defensive, angry. Never seen him like that before. What is he injecting? March 24th. I think Paul experimented on himself. God help us, he's obsessed. Keeps trying to talk like he's gonna fix anything. But what if he's infected? What if he's changing? I don't trust him. Don't know how to tell the others without putting myself at risk. I need to find Jake and get away before it's too late. Alice's fingers trembled as she closed the book, and her stomach turned cold. She looked across the clearing. Paul was awake now, lying on the stretcher, pale and silent, watching them from under half-lidded eyes. Something about his stare made her uneasy. It wasn't just pain, it was something else. Mark noticed the change in her posture and crossed the clearing quickly. "What is it?" he whispered. She handed him the journal. "Rachel kept notes," she said, barely able to speak the words. "About Paul." Mark read quickly, his expression tightening with every line. When he looked up, his eyes were hard, distant. He glanced at Paul, then back at Alice. "We need to talk to him." So together they approached. Paul didn't flinch. He just stared up at them, calm, quiet. Too quiet. "Paul," Mark said carefully, keeping his voice steady, "we found Rachel's journal. She had questions about your work, about what you did." Paul's expression didn't change. He blinked, slow and deliberate, then turned his gaze to Alice. "Did you experiment on yourself?" she asked. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "Did you do something with the virus?" A long silence followed. Then Paul closed his eyes and let out a breath that sounded like it came from somewhere deep. I didn't have a choice," he said, barely above a whisper. "I thought I could beat it. I modified the virus, used it on myself. I thought maybe it would give me immunity. Maybe I could find a way to reverse it." Alice's blood ran cold. "But it didn't work," Paul continued. "Not the way I thought. I'm not infected, not completely, but something's changed. Sometimes I feel stronger, faster, but there's this rage. It builds. I try to fight it, but it's always there, just beneath the surface." Mark's hand drifted toward his weapon. "What kind of rage, Paul?" "I don't know," Paul said, his voice trembling now. "It's not just anger, it's like something wants to take over, like I'm not the only one in here anymore." Alice and Mark exchanged a glance. Fear, betrayal, and something worse lingering between them. "We need to move," Alice said, voice tight. "But we watch him every second." Mark nodded. "If he turns, if he becomes a threat." "We end it," Alice finished, and neither of them looked at Paul again. They packed quickly, the journal tucked into Alice's bag. Rachel's final words had cast a long shadow over the group, and it followed them as they stepped back out into the light. They walked north, toward the mountains, toward a future that suddenly felt even more uncertain. Paul lay on the stretcher between them, silent, eyes closed. But Alice could feel it now. Something had changed, not just in him, but in the world around them. The danger wasn't just out there in the woods or the towns, or the endless sea of the infected. It was walking beside them, and the true horror was only now beginning. Part 2. The harrowing path. The journey north was arduous. Alice, Mark, and the injured Paul trekked through dense forests and across abandoned farmlands, their steps driven by the faint hope of a safe zone in the mountains. The memory of Rachel and Jenny haunted them, their losses a constant reminder of the world they'd left behind. The trio's bond grew stronger with each passing day, their shared mission to survive uniting them against the ever-present threat of the undead. Their supplies steadily dwindled, and the nights grew longer and progressively colder. Paul's condition worsened, his strength fading. They moved cautiously, always alert to the sounds of shuffling feet and the groans of zombies. Hope was their only fuel, the belief that a refuge awaited them somewhere ahead. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they stumbled upon an abandoned farmhouse. The structure, though dilapidated, offered temporary shelter from the harsh elements. They made a quick search of the house, finding a few canned goods and a dusty first aid kit. As usual, it wasn't much, but it was a reprieve from their daily struggle. Inside, they lit a small fire in the old fireplace, the flickering flames casting a warm glow on their weary faces. Alice and Mark took turns tending to Paul, who lay shivering under a threadbare blanket. His fever had spiked again, and his murmured delirium spoke of past horrors and guilt. "Look, we need to find more supplies," Mark said, his voice a low rumble as he sat beside Alice. "We need to find them fast. Paul's not going to make it if we don't." Alice nodded, her eyes never leaving Paul's pale face. "We'll move at first light," she replied, her voice resolute. "We'll find what we need. We have to." As the fire crackled softly, the three of them huddled close, drawing what comfort they could from the fragile warmth. The silence of the night was occasionally punctuated by the distant moans of the undead, a reminder of the ever-present danger lurking just beyond their temporary sanctuary. In the stillness, Alice's mind wandered to Rachel and Jenny, their faces flashing again in her memory. She felt the weight of their loss like a physical burden, but she knew she had to keep going. For them, for Paul, for the hope of a future that was more than just survival. Morning came too soon, the pale light of dawn creeping through the broken windows. Alice and Mark readied themselves for another day of scavenging, their movements silent and efficient. They knew the risks, but they also knew that staying put was not an option. With Paul resting as comfortably as possible, Alice and Mark set out, leaving the safety of the farmhouse behind. The road ahead was uncertain, the dangers many, but they walked with purpose, driven by the belief that somewhere in the vast expanse of this broken world, there was a place where they could rebuild, where they could find peace. As they moved through the overgrown fields, their senses heightened to every sound and movement. They could only hope that their journey would lead them to the refuge they so desperately sought. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, they pressed on, their spirits bolstered by the fragile thread of hope that connected them. Paul had begun to recover, slowly, unevenly, but enough that he could walk again. The food they'd scavenged and the makeshift treatments had helped. But it was more than that. There were days when he seemed stronger than ever, and others where he barely seemed human. They didn't talk about it. It was mid-afternoon when they reached the outskirts of a small, silent town. The sun was muted behind thick clouds, casting a sickly light over the abandoned streets. Storefronts gaped like broken teeth, windows shattered, doors swinging in the breeze. The town was still, but not dead. Not entirely. Here and there distant groans echoed between the buildings, rising and falling like ghostly warnings. The group moved carefully. Each step was measured. Every sound, every flicker in the corner of their eyes set them on edge, and they didn't speak unless they had to. It was Mark who spotted the hardware store, a squat building with boarded-up windows and a makeshift barricade built from shopping carts, sheet metal, and scraps of fencing. Signs of life, or at least survivors. They approached with caution. Inside, dust hung in the air like smoke. It took their eyes a moment to adjust to the dim, and then movement. 2 figures. The woman moved first, tall, lean, with calloused hands and the kind of stare that said she'd seen more than she cared to. She raised her weapon, but didn't fire. The man beside her was twitchy, all restless energy and sharp glances. He stayed a step behind her, but his fingers hovered near the knife on his belt. "Who are you?" the woman asked, her voice steady but edged with steel. Alice raised her hand slightly. "Just travelers, looking for supplies, somewhere safe." The woman's eyes flicked to Paul, who leaned heavily on a shelf, sweat glistening on his brow. After a long moment, she lowered her weapon. "Name's Sarah," she said. "That's Dylan." Dylan stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "How do we know you're not here to rob us?" "We're not," Mark said calmly, stepping beside Alice. "We've got nothing to gain by turning on each other. We help you, you help us. It's survival, basic math." Sarah hesitated, and then gave a single nod. "All right," she said, "but understand this. If anything goes sideways, we handle it quick." The unspoken warning settled between them like smoke. The 5 of them moved through the aisles, picking over what remained. Most of the good stuff was long gone, but there were a few hidden treasures: batteries, cans of food, a nearly full medkit. Alice pocketed a bundle of matches. Mark found a crowbar that hadn't rusted through. Paul wandered further in the back, drawn by some silent instinct. After a few minutes, he called out. They found him crouched over a drawer, a dusty map spread open across his lap. His eyes gleamed, fever bright. "Look," he said, almost breathless. "Military bunkers in the mountains. There's a whole network. This could be it. The safe zone we've been looking for." They all crowded around him. Mark took the map, scanning the markings. Alice leaned in. The paper smelled like mildew and old paperbacks, but the red ink, circles around certain coordinates, stood out. Sarah's face softened slightly. "That's something, if it's real." Dylan snorted. "If. Big if. Could be abandoned. Could be crawling with biters. Could be nothing but a damn tomb." "Could be," Alice said evenly, meeting his gaze. "But it's the only lead we've got." Dylan looked away, muttering under his breath, but he didn't argue further. They packed what they could carry. The medical supplies would help keep Paul stable, if that's what he was. No one dared ask. As they pushed open the barricaded door and stepped out into the fading afternoon light, the shadows had lengthened across the street. A dry wind rolled through, carrying the faint scent of smoke and blood. The map was folded tight and tucked into Alice's jacket. This alliance was fragile, built on necessity, not trust. But for now it would hold. They all headed north, toward the mountains, toward the bunkers, toward whatever waited in that dark unknown. The dead, of course, were still a threat, but now so were the living. And deep inside Paul, something stirred. With a direction at last, and hope pinned to the map Paul had found, the group pressed forward. The days bled into each other. Grey skies, endless walking, the distant hollow moan of the undead never far behind. Sarah proved invaluable. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd survived alone for too long and learned exactly what it took. She was precise, deliberate. She spotted movement before the rest of them, found food where none should have remained, and more than once her quick thinking kept them from walking straight into packs of the dead. In a world fraying at the edges, she was a thread keeping them together. But Dylan was a different story. He slipped away often, without warning, without reason, and returned with excuses that never quite added up. His eyes carried shadows. He watched Paul too closely. Watched all of them sometimes, and when he spoke, it was with a coiled tension, like a man trying to keep something buried just beneath the surface. Alice noticed first. She always did. One evening they found shelter in a crumbling farmhouse surrounded by dead cornfields. The wind howled through broken shutters, and the night stretched long and cold. Paul was getting worse, burning up with fever, his breath shallow, his skin clammy. Alice never left his side, using what little remained of their medical supplies. Mark and Sarah rotated guard shifts, always alert. Meanwhile, Dylan paced. He muttered to himself when he thought no one was listening, fractured words, half sentences. Alice caught a few. Virus, test subject, not natural. She told Mark quietly. Oh, neither of them slept much after that. And then Dylan vanished again. At first, no one noticed. The fire was low and the room thick with exhaustion. Alice dabbed Paul's forehead with a damp cloth. Mark stared at the map for the 100th time. Sarah sharpened a blade with the kind of focus that came from dread. And hours later, he returned. But he wasn't alone. They heard the boots first, too many to count. Then the door creaked open and Dylan stepped in, flanked by half a dozen strangers. Dirty, armed, and hard-eyed. Men and women who moved like wolves in human skin. The kind who'd long since given up on morality for survival. These are friends, Dylan said, but his eyes were cold. There was no warmth in his voice, just calculation. One of the newcomers stepped forward, a thick-set man with a scar running down the side of his face like a jagged canyon. His name, he said, was Rick. We heard you got a map, he said, to some bunkers up in the mountains, military grade. Oh, we're going to need that. Silence fell. Alice reached for her bag. Mark rose slowly, placing himself between the group and the fire, hand drifting to his knife. Sarah stood too, already reading the room. We don't want to fight, Mark said, voice level, but the map stays with us. Rick took a step closer, his men tense behind him. You, sure about that? From the mattress in the corner, Paul stirred. His voice, though weak, cut through the tension like a razor. Don't let him take it. His eyes opened, glassy, distant but fierce. We have to reach the safe zone. Sarah moved beside Mark, her stance rigid. We're not giving up, she said. You want to come? Then fall in line. Otherwise, walk away. Rick studied them, their worn faces, their makeshift weapons, their exhaustion. But there was something else, too. Resolve. Eventually, he nodded. Fine, he said, but we're watching you. The uneasy truce that followed was brittle. Rick's group kept to themselves, but their presence shifted the dynamic like poison in water. Every conversation was measured. Every silence was heavier. The campfire no longer brought warmth, only watchfulness. Dylan was the wedge. He moved between the two groups, but belonged to neither. His smirk returned, more smug now. Yeah, he had leverage and he knew it. But Alice never let him out of her sight. She didn't trust him, not anymore. They left the farmhouse at dawn. Paul, barely able to walk, leaned heavily on Alice and Mark. The mountains rose in the distance like jagged teeth, ominous and unreachable. But the map led there, and Paul, against all odds, still believed. Each day forward felt harder, the terrain rougher, the silence deeper. They started out fearing the infected. Now they feared each other, and deep inside a question gnawed at them all, spoken by none, felt by everyone. What had Dylan done? And what would he do next? It all came to a head the night they reached the next safe haven. Rick stood like a wall at the center of the room, his frame casting a long shadow in the flickering firelight. The air was thick, cloaked in sweat, fear, and the sour stink of unspoken threats. We need that map, he growled, voice low and hard as stone. We're taking charge now. You're either with us or against us. His hand rested on his rifle, a silent message. As usual, Mark didn't flinch. He stepped forward, placing himself between Rick and the others, his face carved from defiance. "We're not handing it over," he said. "We do this together or not at all." The room fractured in an instant. Shouts erupted, weapons were drawn, the fire crackled violently, casting shadows that danced like ghosts across the cracked walls. Mark's hand hovered near his blade. Sarah moved into position, eyes cold and sharp. Alice stood beside them, unmoving, unwavering. On the floor, Paul stirred. And then, convulsed. His body jerked violently, limbs thrashing, mouth opening in a silent scream. His skin lost all color, lips turning blue, and his eyes rolled back into his skull. "Shit, he's turning!" one of Rick's men screamed, raising his gun, finger twitching on the trigger. Well, panic tore through the room like wildfire. People screamed, chairs overturned, guns pointed in every direction. "No!" Alice dropped to the ground, cradling Paul's head, tears cutting down her cheeks. "Stay with us, Paul. Please, stay with me." Mark knelt beside her, shielding them both, unsure if he was protecting Paul or preparing to end him if the worst happened. And in the chaos, Dylan vanished. No one saw him slip through the door. No one noticed the map disappear from its hiding place. His silhouette was gone in seconds, swallowed by the dark, the stolen hope clutched in his hands like a trophy. When Alice looked up, the map was gone. Mark's eyes scanned the room, and then locked with hers. He took a breath. "Dylan." Alice nodded grimly. "We need to get out of here," Mark barked, rising fast. "Now." Sarah was already moving. She shoved past a pair of Rick's people arguing, shouldering her way through the door and waved them forward. The room behind them devolved into chaos, shouting, shoving, gunfire sparking off wood and stone. Rick's group, fractured by fear and distrust, turned on itself as quickly as it had formed. Mark grabbed Paul under the arms, hoisting him up. Alice and Sarah flanked him, cutting through the bedlam like a blade. The cold night slammed into them the moment they breached the door, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. The farmhouse shrank behind them. The firelight faded. The shouts and gunshots blurred into distant noise. Only the sound of their breath, ragged and desperate, remained real. They ran until their legs screamed, till their lungs burned. And finally, when the trees thickened around them and darkness swallowed the sky, they collapsed into a thicket, half hidden by brambles and silence. Mark laid Paul down as gently as he could. Alice dropped to her knees beside him, brushing the hair from his sweat-slicked brow. Oh, his skin was clammy, his breath barely there. "We need shelter," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "And meds. We're running out of time." Sarah crouched beside her, chest heaving. "We'll find them," she said. "We have to." They sat there for a long moment. No map, no direction, just the cold, the dark, and the weight of betrayal heavy on their shoulders. But they weren't done, not yet. The safe zone still lay somewhere beyond those hills, somewhere past the dead, the desperate, and the damned. They didn't know how they'd get there, only that they would. They found shelter in a cave carved into the side of a moss-choked hillside, half swallowed by the forest. The jagged entrance offered little comfort, but it was narrow enough to defend, and for now that was enough. The forest beyond remained quiet, too quiet, as though nature itself held its breath. Inside, shadows danced along the stone walls. The fire crackled low, casting flickers of warmth that did little to chase the cold from their bones. Paul lay still, tucked beneath a blanket of spare clothing and desperation. His fever had broken slightly, but his eyes stayed glassy, his breath shallow and erratic. He mumbled nonsense in his sleep. Names, places, regrets. Mark and Alice sat nearby, slumped against the wall, their muscles locked with exhaustion and nerves strung taut. Sarah crouched by the entrance, her rifle steady, her breath slow and controlled. She hadn't slept. She couldn't afford to. As the first hints of dawn bled through the canopy outside, that silence shattered. Crunching footsteps, slow, deliberate, filtered through the undergrowth like a death march. Rick's people were coming. Mark was already on his feet, weapon in hand. "They've found us," he said, his voice low and clipped. "Get ready." Alice took her position beside Paul, gripping a rusted pistol, her face pale but resolute. Sarah adjusted her aim, one eye narrowed as she focused on the shadows beyond the cave's mouth. Then everything exploded. A figure lunged into view, and the first crack of gunfire tore through the morning air. Bullets sparked off the rocks, screams echoing in the tight confines of the cave. Shadows twisted into soldiers. The fight was brutal, fast, and chaotic. Alice crouched low, shielding Paul while firing into the melee. Mark moved like a ghost through smoke, calm, lethal, every shot deliberate. Sarah, from her perch, dropped attackers one by one with terrifying precision. But they were outnumbered. Bodies slammed into stone, shouts mixed with the sickening wet thuds of fists and gunfire. And through it all stirred. "The virus," he whispered, voice barely audible. Alice leaned in, straining to hear him over the chaos. "I experimented. I thought I could fix it, find a cure. But it didn't work. I think I made it worse." His words hit her like a gut punch. Alice stared down at him, stunned. Horror twisted her features as the truth sank in. Paul's illness wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a consequence. Of failure. Of good intentions gone wrong, and now they were all at risk. But there was no time to dwell. Rick burst into the cave, blood on his face, madness in his eyes. He charged, and Mark met him in a brutal collision. Guns forgotten, the two men locked in a primal struggle, fists, knees, elbows, a flurry of violence in the firelight. Every hit Mark landed was for the people they'd lost. Every blow Rick returned was fueled by obsession and desperation. They fought like men with nothing left to lose. And then Dylan stepped out of the shadows, grinning like a devil, map held high in one hand. "Is this what you all want, yeah?" he called out, voice echoing off the walls. "Well, too bad." And he tossed it into the flames. For a second, the world stopped. All noise drowned out by the crackle of fire and the slow curling of paper as the map, their only guide, their only hope, blackened and turned to ash. "You bastard!" Alice screamed, surging forward. Rick's attention snapped towards the flames, his focus shattered. Mark didn't hesitate. One swift, punishing blow and Rick fell. Blood pooled beneath him. The warlord of chaos silenced. Leaderless, Rick's men faltered. The firelight turned their rage to fear, their ambition to retreat. One by one they scattered into the trees, the threat dissolving into the mist of morning. The cave felt quiet again, just the crackle of dying fire and the rasp of heavy breath. Alice dropped beside Paul, brushing his damp hair from his forehead. His lips were deathly pale, his pulse weak. Mark collapsed near the wall, gun in hand, eyes scanning the room like he expected another ghost to emerge from the shadows. Blood ran down his temple, but he didn't seem to notice. Sarah leaned against a rock, clutching her side, blood seeping through her fingers. Still standing, though, still breathing. They had survived. But at what cost? The map was gone. Paul's confession hung over them like smoke. Whatever future they'd once dreamed of now felt murky, tangled in lies and firelight. And yet, they were still alive. Alice turned to Mark, her voice hoarse. "We have to keep going." He nodded. "We will. Somehow." Outside, the sun began to rise over the ravaged treetops, casting a pale light on the bloodied survivors. They had no map, no clear path, but they had each other, and for now that had to be enough. Just when the air was thick with the certainty of defeat, a new sound cut through the chaos. More footsteps, more figures emerging from the shadows of the forest. Weapons snapped into place, every muscle in Alice and Mark's bodies tensed. But this time, it wasn't another wave of Rick's men. It was Dylan, and he wasn't alone. A small group of rugged survivors flanked him, scrappy, scarred, but alert. For one terrifying heartbeat, no one knew what to expect. Then Dylan raised his hand and pointed it at Rick's forces. "Now," he ordered. Gunfire erupted, but not toward Alice and Mark. Dylan's group fell on Rick's men like wolves. It was chaos, but a different kind, one that turned the tide. Caught completely off guard, Rick's crew fractured. Those that weren't cut down turned tail and fled into the forest, their loyalty shattered under the weight of betrayal. When the dust finally settled, only the sound of panting breath and crackling flames remained. Blood smeared the walls, and the cave stank of smoke and violence. Dylan stepped forward, his expression unreadable, eyes flickering with something that could have been guilt, or maybe just satisfaction. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out the map, the real map. He held it out to Alice. "I figured you might still need this," he said quietly, all traces of his usual swagger gone. Alice hesitated. Her hand hovered for a second too long before taking it. Her eyes didn't leave his. "Why?" Dylan just shrugged. "Because I'm not ready to die, and neither are you." She looked at Mark. He gave the barest of nods, jaw tight with unspoken warnings. They didn't trust Dylan, but trust wasn't the currency of survival anymore. Necessity was. Paul moaned weakly. His skin was even more pale, his breath ragged and shallow. Alice was instantly at his side, checking his pulse. Her voice, when it came, was tight and urgent. "We can't stay. He won't make it here." Sarah limped closer, clutching her side. Her eyes were red-rimmed but clear. "We need shelter, supplies, somewhere better than this." Dylan turned, his new group gathering behind him. They were lean, tired, but ready. One of them, a woman with a jagged scar across her throat, nodded toward him, silently awaiting orders. He turned back to Alice and Mark. "There's a path through the southern ridge. I know the area. We'll avoid the dead if we move fast. The safe zone's still our best shot." Mark studied him for a long moment, then looked at Alice. She gave a reluctant nod. "For now," Mark said. "But one wrong move, Dylan." "Yeah, you'll shoot me," Dylan finished. Yeah, I get it." They packed quickly. Alice wrapped Paul in a makeshift stretcher fashioned from spare jackets and canvas. With Mark and one of Dylan's allies carrying the weight, they began the trek through the dense forest. But every step was a gamble. The undead roamed unpredictably, their groans often echoing just far enough away to fray nerves. The forest floor was a minefield of broken branches and hidden roots, each one a potential death sentence if it caused a stumble. The group moved in silence, hyper-aware of every sound, every shift of wind, every rustle in the trees. Dylan led with sharp-eyed confidence, his instincts razor-honed. He didn't speak much, but his directions kept them on narrow trails, far from the main roads where both infected and hostile survivors hunted like predators. By nightfall, they'd reached an abandoned hunting cabin nestled in a glade of skeletal birch trees. It wasn't much, 4 walls, a roof, and the remnants of a wood stove, but it was shelter. Inside, Alice worked through the night to stabilize Paul once more. Her hands shook, but she didn't stop, using the last of their supplies to fight off his infection. Mark and Sarah took turns on watch, their weapons never more than an arm's reach away. In the quiet hours before dawn, the darkness pressed in. Not just the natural night, but the weight of what Paul had confessed. His voice, trembling with guilt, echoed in their minds. "I tried to cure it, but I think I made it worse." Well, the apocalypse might not have been a random catastrophe. It might have started right here in a lab, with Paul, with good intentions that turned monstrous. And now that burden followed them like a second shadow. When morning came, the sky was a dull slate grey. Paul was still alive, barely, but his fever had eased. For the first time in days, there was a flicker of hope. Alice stood, her face set with quiet determination. "We move at first light. We can't lose momentum now." The others nodded, exhaustion hanging off them like wet clothes, but they understood. The map now led toward the mountains, where the remnants of military bunkers and the promise of safety waited like a distant prayer. No one spoke as they left the cabin, but every step they took, through the ash-stained leaves and under the pale, watchful sky, was a step closer to something that might save them, or damn them all. For now, the alliance held, fragile, uneasy, but it held. And in a world gone mad, that was all they had left. As they prepared to leave, Alice stumbled upon Rachel's journal once more. During their frantic escape, she tucked it away, but now in a rare moment of quiet, she opened it to the final pages. Her heart sank as she read Rachel's last, desperate words. March 29th. God, I don't trust Paul. His obsession with the virus is dangerous. I saw him inject himself with something. Since then, he's been different. What if he's becoming something worse than the undead? We have to be careful. Alice's blood ran cold as she finished reading. She shared this entry with Mark, their eyes meeting in silent horror. The man they'd risked everything for, the one they'd hoped would lead them to safety, might be the greatest threat of all. They looked at Paul, lying weak and feverish, his fate uncertain. His skin, as always, pale and clammy. He seemed to hold a secret that chilled them to the bone. Then they glanced at Dylan, whose actions and intentions remained a constant enigma. His betrayal within a betrayal left them unsure whether to trust his recent aid or fear his next move. As they set out once more, their hearts heavy with fear and suspicion, the path ahead seemed even more perilous. The forest, dense and foreboding, closed in around them, its shadows hiding not just the undead but the treacherous complexities of human nature too. Every step they took was laden with doubt. Was Paul a ticking time bomb, a potential new breed of threat, as Rachel had feared? And what of Dylan? His sudden turn to their aid, his mysterious group of survivors, what were his true motives? The safe zone, once their beacon of hope, now felt like a distant mirage, its promise overshadowed by the unknown dangers that accompanied them. As they trudged forward, the journal's revelation gnawed at them. Trust had become a fragile, dangerous luxury. They moved with renewed vigilance, every glance at Paul filled with unspoken questions, every interaction with Dylan laced with caution. The true nature of their journey had shifted. Survival now hinged not only on evading the undead, but on deciphering the human threats among them. The safe zone was still out there, a possible sanctuary in a world gone mad. Yet reaching it would require navigating the dark corridors of mistrust and fear that now defined their existence. As the forest thickened and the shadows grew longer, Alice and Mark could only hope that their instincts would guide them through. The fight for survival was far from over, and the greatest dangers lay not in the shambling hordes of the undead, but in the hearts of those who walked right beside them. And as they moved deeper into the unknown, one thought echoed in their minds: survival at all costs. Part 3. Survival's Last Stand. With each passing day, the journey only grew harder. Alice, Mark, Sarah, Dylan, and the barely conscious Paul pushed ever deeper into the forest, their bodies beaten down, their minds gnawed at by Rachel's warning. What once had been a map of hope now felt like a slow death sentence stretched out across endless miles of dying wilderness. Paul's condition kept slipping, dragging like an anchor behind them. They could only hope it was worth their while keeping him with them. His fever burned hotter with every wasted hour, and Alice was fighting a losing battle to keep him alive. The long cold nights were spent tending to him, while the days blurred into each other, carved into the worry lines around her tired eyes. Supplies were almost gone. She was out of options, but she hadn't quite run out of stubbornness yet. Mark had grown harder too. Every sound in the trees set him on edge. His mistrust of Dylan, once just a quiet unease, had now turned into a constant, low-grade rage. Every time Dylan slipped off into the woods without explanation and reappeared just as silently, it added more cracks to the brittle trust barely holding the group together. What made it worse was Dylan didn't offer any excuses, didn't offer much of anything. Fair enough, his knowledge of the land had saved them more than once, but it didn't make him any less of a walking question mark. His presence felt like a double-edged blade, useful, but just as likely to cut you when you least expected it. Sarah hung on, her body failing but her will to survive as stubborn as hell. The infection in her wounded arm was getting worse, though. You could see it in the way she gritted her teeth, the way her steps grew heavier, slower. But she never complained. No, she just kept moving, one battered foot in front of the other. They all did. What choice did they have? The mountains loomed ahead, jagged against the grey horizon, the forest thinning into brutal rocky slopes. The ground grew treacherous. Loose stones that threatened to snap ankles, narrow ledges where one wrong step would be fatal. And always, always, the moans of the dead somewhere behind them, closer than comfort allowed. Now the safe zone was close, but so was everything else waiting to tear them apart. The map, battered, crumpled, stained with blood and sweat, felt less like a promise and more like a curse now. It dangled hope in front of them like bait, but every mile made it clear. Getting there was going to cost them everything they had left. They made camp in a narrow glen, the last light of day bleeding out like a dying animal. The fire they scraped together crackled low, hidden under a mess of branches and stone. The only other sound was breathing, ragged, strained. That's when Paul started seizing. Oh, it happened fast. 1 second he was still, the next he jerked violently, his whole body thrashing against the earth. Alice was on him before anyone else moved, barking orders through the panic. Mark dropped the supplies and pinned Paul down, his muscles straining against the spasms. "Hold him still," Alice snapped, her voice razor-edged with fear. Mark grunted, wrestling Paul's convulsing frame. "What the hell's happening?" Paul's skin was paper white now, slick with sweat. His eyes rolled back into his skull, and broken words slipped out between grasps. "The virus inside me, spreading." The words hit like a hammer to the gut. The camp froze. No breath, no movement, just the fire crackling and the awful, helpless sounds coming from Paul. Alice stared down at him, her hands trembling. A knot of pure terror twisted inside her. This wasn't just a fever. This was the beginning of the end. This was the virus winning. Dylan stood off to the side, arms folded, face unreadable, like he was already writing Paul off. "If he's turning," he said flatly, "dragging him along is suicide. We always knew this was a risk. We can't keep him any longer." Sarah staggered closer, pale as death, but still standing. "We don't leave our own," she growled, voice crackling from the effort. Alice looked up at Mark, desperate for an answer, something, anything. Her voice shook. "There's got to be a way. We can't just give up." Mark's jaw locked tight. He looked from Paul to the rest of them. Sarah barely upright, Dylan already halfway checked out, and nodded once. "We're not leaving him," he said. "We find a way, together." Well, nobody argued, not even Dylan, though the silence between them spoke louder than any words. That night they huddled around Paul's unconscious body, no one sleeping, no one daring to close their eyes. They listened to the dead whisper through the trees and waited for whatever was going to happen next. The safe zone was close. So was the edge they were about to fall off of. First light they pushed on. They cobbled together yet another rough stretcher from scavenged wood and frayed rope, lashed Paul's body to it and began dragging him up into the mountains. Every step was a fresh hell. Well, Dylan grew worse as the days bled together. His muttering got louder, his eyes twitchier. He kept vanishing into the trees and coming back hours later without a word. Whatever loyalty had once existed between him and the rest of the group was hanging by a thread, and that thread was burning. Alice and Mark knew it. Sarah tried to play peacekeeper, but she was fading fast, too battered to hold the cracks together. Every night, around the fire, the silence between them grew heavier, stretched thinner. Paranoia settled into their bones, making every glance a loaded weapon. The mountains loomed above them like the jaws of some ancient beast waiting to snap shut. Well, it eventually happened on one of those afternoons when Dylan was off God knows where. The attack came without warning. A blur of rotten flesh and snapping teeth. Feral zombies, too fast, too vicious. They swarmed out of the rocks like a nightmare made real. Well, Mark swung his scavenged weapon, a pipe wrench from an abandoned building, knocking zombies to the ground with brutal efficiency. But they just kept coming. Alice fought back too, standing over Paul's helpless body, her training forgotten, survival instincts taking over. Sarah, even half dead and burning with fever, fought like a cornered animal. Well, the fight was blood and screaming and chaos. And then Sarah was bitten. It's like the world stopped for a second. A jagged, brutal second, and then the panic rushed in. "No!" Alice screamed, stumbling toward her. There was no time to think, no time to second-guess. Mark and Alice acted on raw instinct, pinning Sarah down as Alice pulled out her only remaining medical blade. Sarah's screams tore through the mountains as Alice soared through flesh and bone, her hands slippery with blood and terror. It was crude, it was brutal, but it was the only shot they had to stop the infection from claiming her. When it was over, the ground was littered with the dead, and the living weren't much better off. Sarah lay unconscious, shock, pale, and bleeding out. Paul was still dead weight on the stretcher, and the rest of them were just ghosts dragging broken bodies up a mountain no one was sure they'd ever reach the top of. As the night dropped like a hammer, Dylan finally returned. He stepped into camp with that same flat, indifferent look, barely glancing at the wreckage before him. "What happened?" he asked, voice almost mocking. Alice and Mark glared at him, too tired and too hollow to even shout. "We were attacked," Mark said, his voice rough as gravel. "Where the hell were you?" "Scouting," Dylan said with a shrug, eyes flicking to Sarah's unconscious form, and then to Paul's stretcher. "We can't afford to lose anyone else." The words were wrong. All wrong. Like he was already counting bodies. The fire crackled between them, thin and dying. The mountains pressed closer, cold and merciless. The road ahead was going to be pure hell, but there was no turning back now. There never had been. They reached a high plateau just as the wind picked up, scraping across the rocks like a warning. Before them stood an abandoned military outpost, rusted gates, barbed wire curling like razor-edged vines. A fortress against a dead world. It looked like salvation, but it felt like a trap. Paul and Sarah were both slipping fast, their shallow breaths misting in the freezing air. They had no choice. They had to get inside. Dylan moved with eerie certainty, leading them to a hidden service hatch along the fence line. His hands found latches and codes too easily. Alice and Mark exchanged a glance, unease threading between them. How the hell did he know this place so well? I used to work in facilities like this, Dylan said when Mark pressed him, his voice flat, somewhat evasive. Doesn't matter now. We need inside. No one trusted him, but they needed him. That was the awful truth. The hatch creaked open, revealing a narrow tunnel that spat them into a silent corridor. The air was stale and metallic, heavy with the ghosts of whatever happened here before. Inside they found a small miracle. Dusty cabinets full of medical supplies, a half-functional lab tucked behind blast-proof doors, bandages, antibiotics, morphine. Enough to buy Paul and Sarah a little more time. Alice worked furiously, her hands trembling with exhaustion as she cleaned wounds and stitched torn flesh. Sarah moaned weakly but hung on. Paul barely moved, his skin waxen, breath rattling. Meanwhile, Dylan vanished into the deeper corridors, claiming he was scouting for more supplies. His absences grew longer, his excuses thinner. It was during one of these absences that Alice found the file cabinet, a rusted thing tucked behind an overturned desk. Inside, reports, names, classified documents stamped with angry red ink. She scanned the pages, her heart hammering. Experiments, virus strains, test subjects. One name jumped out at her. Paul. A photo accompanied the file. Paul, younger but unmistakable, standing beside a bank of lab equipment, a nervous smile on his face. He hadn't just survived the outbreak. He had helped create it. Alice staggered back, bile rising in her throat. She found Paul barely conscious on the stretcher. Rage and heartbreak twisted inside her as she knelt beside him. "Paul," she whispered, voice cracking. "What did you do?" His eyes fluttered open. He saw the file in her hands and closed his eyes like he couldn't bear it. We're trying to cure a disease," he rasped. "A rare, lethal virus. We thought we could stop it. But it mutated, it got loose. I thought..." He broke off, tears slipping down his cheeks. "I thought I could fix it. I thought I could fix everything." Mark heard it too. His face darkened, fists clenching at his sides. "You knew all this time," he said, voice low and dangerous. "You brought this on all of us." "I'm sorry," Paul whispered. "I was trying to make it right." But there was no right anymore. Only survival. And survival demanded hard choices. The tension in the outpost snapped like a cable under strain. Paul lay pale and broken, his confession hanging in the air like smoke. Mark paced furiously, while Alice sat frozen, the file clutched in her lap. And that's when Dylan returned. And he wasn't alone. He carried a weapon now, cradling it casually like an extension of his body. His eyes were hard, calculating. "We use him," Dylan said simply, nodding at Paul. He's the key to the cure. We experiment on him, find the reversal before it's too late. You're insane, Mark growled, stepping between Dylan and Paul. Dylan shook his head. I'm realistic. You think you're going to walk to safety dragging dead weight? He's our leverage against this virus, our only chance. Alice stood, heart pounding. There has to be another way. There isn't. Dylan's voice was calm, almost pitying. There never was. Then the room exploded into violence. Mark lunged, but Dylan was ready. Years of survival honed into brutal precision. He slammed Mark against the wall, drawing the gun. Alice moved to help, but Dylan grabbed her, wrenching her arm behind her back, pressing the cold muzzle to her temple. Stay down, he barked. This whole thing ends now. Mark wiped blood from his mouth, panting. You're no better than the people who started this, he spat. Dylan's face twisted, a crack in his armor. I'm better because I'll finish it. Paul stirred weakly on the stretcher. His voice, ragged but steady, cut through the chaos. Dylan, you're wrong. This isn't saving anyone. It's just more death. For a heartbeat, Dylan faltered. The desperation flickered in his eyes. That tiny crack widened. Alice seized the moment. Her voice was low and deadly calm. You're becoming the very thing you swore to fight. The words hit harder than any fist. In that instant of hesitation, Mark lunged again, this time connecting. He tackled Dylan hard, sending them both sprawling. And then the gun went off. A single, deafening shot. Silence. Dylan lay sprawled on the floor, unmoving. But he was breathing. They slowly turned him over to reveal he was uninjured other than the slightest of wounds where the shot had grazed him from the gun too close to his body. Alice stumbled back, her chest heaving. Mark wiped some blood from his forehead, hands shaking. They tried to help Paul to his feet. He was barely conscious but alive. We should move, Mark said hoarsely. Now. Together, broken, battered, but not defeated, they started gathering what supplies they could carry. Sarah, still unconscious but breathing, was hoisted onto the makeshift stretcher. Mark, battered but unyielding, had fought back with Alice's help. Together, fueled by desperation, they'd successfully overpowered Dylan, binding him tightly with anything they could find. While he thrashed against his restraints, eyes burning with rage. You think you can save him? Dylan sneered, his voice thick with contempt. The lab's real, you know. It's down below. But it won't save you. It's already too late. Ignoring his venomous words, Alice and Mark dragged him toward the hidden lab that he'd just revealed. Behind a heavy steel door, they found it. A cavernous room filled with sophisticated equipment, medical instruments gleaming under cold fluorescent lights. Stacks of crumbling documents and faded notes lined the walls, each one a grim record of the experiments that had gone horribly wrong. Paul, barely conscious at this point, gazed at the room with haunted eyes. Recognition and sorrow flashed across his face. This is it, he rasped. This is where it began. God, I have to finish it. I have to try. His voice was thin, but the determination in it was unmistakable. Despite everything, Paul volunteered for one final attempt to undo the damage he'd helped unleash. It was a gamble they couldn't afford not to take. Alice and Mark moved quickly, studying the notes and powering up the machines. Every second counted. Sarah, still vigilant although wounded, took up a position by the entrance, clutching a weapon with trembling hands, ready to hold off anything or anyone that might try to break through. They strapped Paul onto the gurney, his body trembling as the procedure began. Oh, it was brutal. Paul's screams tore through the lab, raw and unfiltered, but Alice and Mark kept going, their hands sure even as terror gnawed at their resolve. Outside, the moans of the dead grew louder, more urgent. The scent of life had drawn them like a beacon. Sarah tightened her grip on her weapon, scanning the shadows. "Come on, stay with me, Paul," Alice whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising chorus of the undead. "Just a little longer." Mark adjusted the machines, sweat dripping down his brow. The pounding on the outpost's gates grew more violent, closer. Time was running out. Paul convulsed violently, his body thrashing against the restraints, and then, suddenly, he lay still. The world seemed to stop. Alice and Mark hovered over him, barely daring to breathe. Seconds stretched into an eternity, until Paul's eyes flickered open, clear and sharp. I think it's working," he croaked, a flicker of hope sparking in his voice. But there was no time to rejoice. A deafening crash echoed from the corridor. The outer barriers had failed. Sarah's warning cry rang out as the first of the zombies staggered into view, their hollow eyes fixed hungrily on the living. Alice and Mark grabbed the nearest makeshift weapons, their bodies moving on pure instinct now. Side by side, they stood their ground, shielding Paul and the fragile hope he represented from the nightmare clawing its way toward them. This time they weren't fighting just to survive. They were fighting for the chance to end the nightmare for good. As good as it was that the procedure seemed to be working, their joy was extinguished as the heavy lab doors groaned and then completely buckled under the relentless assault. With a deafening crash, the undead swarmed through, their guttural wails chilling the blood. In the chaos, Dylan seized his moment. Slipping free of his restraints, he bolted toward a control panel, a wild gleam in his eyes. "Dylan, no!" Mark shouted, lunging after him. But he was a second too late. Grinning wickedly, Dylan slammed his hand down on the console. "If I can't have the cure, no one can," he snarled, and vanished into the shadows. A blaring alarm erupted throughout the facility, and a cold mechanical voice echoed over the chaos. "Self-destruct sequence initiated. Evacuate immediately. 10, 9. Paul, still weak and unsteady, but driven by sheer will, forced himself upright. "This way," he gasped, beckoning the others. Guided by memories buried deep in his fractured mind, Paul led Alice, Spark, and Sarah through a maze of dimly lit corridors toward a hidden secondary exit, their only hope of escape. 6, 5, 4. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the self-destruct neared its climax. Doors slammed shut around them, lights flickered and died. With a final desperate sprint, they burst through the exit just as a roar of fire and metal engulfed the outpost behind them. The shockwave threw them like rag dolls, the searing heat licking at their backs. Gasping for breath, they pulled themselves together a safe distance away. The night sky burned red as the outpost was reduced to a smouldering ruin. They were alive, but barely. The numbers had thinned, their supplies were gone, their hope was hanging by a thread. And yet the heart of their group, the part that mattered most, had survived. Paul, struggling to stay upright, stared back at the inferno with hollow eyes. "The cure isn't complete," he said, voice low but steady, "but it's a beginning." As they caught their breath, a grim realization set in. Dylan was again nowhere to be seen. "Oh, damn, he took the notes," Mark said bitterly, clenching his fists. "He's got the key to everything." In the shadows of the burning wasteland, Dylan had slipped away into the night. The dangerous wildcard with the power to doom them, or worse. But there was no time for despair. Ahead lay the treacherous mountain paths, the long road to the rumoured safe zone, as well as countless dangers waiting in the dark. Their journey was far from over, and every step they took now would test their strength, their loyalty to each other, and their very humanity. But together they pressed forward. They would fight not just for survival, but for the chance to rebuild something from the ashes. And yet somewhere, lurking in the ruins of this world, Dylan waited. Part 4. Final Reckoning. The mountain path was narrow and treacherous, its jagged rocks and steep drops turning every step into a battle against exhaustion. The four of them pressed on, their bodies screaming for rest, their minds haunted by everything they'd endured to reach this point. Far ahead, a flicker of salvation shimmered on the horizon. The safe zone. A place spoken of in whispers around dying campfires, a place that promised shelter, security, maybe even a second chance. The scars they carried, both seen and unseen, were weighing heavy, tempering hope with grim remembrance. Alice, as ever, led the way, her steps steady despite the crushing fatigue. Grief and loss clung to her like a second skin, an invisible chain around her soul. Once she'd been driven by bright-eyed hope, now she moved with a fierce, unbreakable resolve. Every betrayal, every death, every sleepless night had forged her into the leader that they needed. And of course Mark marched at her side, his body a patchwork of old wounds and fresh ones. His face was weathered and hard, carved by too many battles and too many regrets. But behind the scars, his loyalty burned like a torch. No matter what they faced, Mark would see this journey through. He'd made a silent promise to himself. No more losses. Oh, not if he could help it. Sarah followed close behind. The pain of her recent amputation was a constant gnawing companion, yet she refused to falter. With one arm she gripped her weapon, with what was left of the other, she shielded what remained of her hope. Her eyes, sharp as broken glass, scanned the tree line, alert for any threat lurking in the shadows. Paul, still frail but breathing, stumbled along, supported by sheer will. While the fever still clung to him, the ghost refusing to let go. His experimental cure fought a silent war inside his veins, unstable, unpredictable, but alive. His mistakes had helped unleash this nightmare on the world. Redemption was his only purpose now, and though his steps wavered, his resolve certainly did not. Together the group pushed forward, the chill of the highlands biting into their skin, the dying light not helping. Their supplies were dwindling once more. Every decision, every breath, carried the weight of survival. Behind them lingered the ghost of Dylan's betrayal, that poisonous memory that whispered doubts and suspicion into the cracks of their unity. And ahead, just beyond reach, loomed the fortified walls of the safe zone, the beacon of hope in a world that had nearly forgotten the meaning of the word. The final stretch of their journey lay before them, one last gauntlet to run before they could lay down their burdens. But the mountains would not let them pass easily, and even within the walls of the safe zone they knew new battles would await. In that fleeting fragile moment, surrounded by stone and shadow and the cold breath of fate, they steeled themselves for what was to come. A fight for something greater, the chance to reclaim their humanity from the ashes. The rugged trail finally began to level out, and there it was, the safe zone, its fortified walls silhouetted against the dying light. Relief barely had time to flicker in their hearts before a sudden, brutal ambush shattered the fragile calm. From the dense undergrowth and craggy crevices, a rival faction of survivors erupted into view, their faces twisted with zeal and desperation. They each wielded makeshift weapons and clutched tattered sheaves of paper. Dylan's stolen research, copied and smeared with ink and blood, treated now as a holy scripture. To them, those notes were salvation incarnate, a cure, the future, power. "Hand over the cure," roared a leader from the faction, his voice a whip crack across the stone. "It belongs to us. We alone will rebuild this world." Their hearts hammered in their chests, their every instinct screaming. Alice scanned the rocky terrain for any escape route, while Mark moved instinctively to shield Sarah and Paul. The enemy closed in fast, boots pounding on loose stones, a frenzy of shouts and snarled demands filling the air. But louder than all of it, rising like a wave from the darkness, came a different sound. That familiar, low, guttural moaning, hungry, hollow, relentless. The chaos had summoned something worse. From the shadows crept a fresh horde of the undead, drawn by the noise, their decaying bodies dragging through the rocks, their mildewed eyes locking onto the living. One by one, and then in a tidal wave, they swarmed closer, their ragged moans slicing through the mountain air. Two forces now converged, the frenzied fanatics and the ravenous dead. The attackers, so sure of their victory moments ago, hesitated, caught between their thirst for dominance and the primal terror of the approaching horde. The tension in the air was electric, every second stretched taut to the breaking point. The rival leader, his face a grim mask of ambition and fear, barked frantic orders to his men. His people wavered, torn between fighting for the cure and running for their lives. And in the eye of this storm stood Alice, Mark, Sarah, and Paul, no longer just survivors, now warriors at the brink of yet another brutal trial. The clear path to salvation had vanished, swallowed by chaos and bloodlust, and the mountain trembled under the weight of what was coming, a clash not just of man against man, but of life against death itself. Forced to retreat in the wake of the ambush, the group scrambled for cover, their hearts hammering as they darted into the narrow refuge of a deep ravine. The rocky walls closed in around them, offering a precarious sanctuary from the chaos outside. Thunderous shouts and the groans of the encroaching undead echoed up the slope, and every breath they took was laced with fear and adrenaline. Inside their temporary haven, tensions boiled over. Huddled together in the dim light of a makeshift fire, the survivors debated their next move with voices raw from exhaustion. "We have to negotiate with them," argued one of the more cautious members of the rival faction who had been captured during the retreat, though his plea barely registered with the group. Alice, her eyes fierce and determined, countered. "Negotiation could leave us vulnerable. We can't risk another all-out confrontation." Mark's voice, gruff with anger, joined the fray as he demanded, "We need to secure the cure research. If those notes hold the key, we can turn this nightmare around." Amid their heated discussion, Paul, still weak but resolute, murmured his support for a direct action plan to retrieve the stolen research. Amid these clashes of opinion, whispered rumors began to circulate among the survivors. There were murmurs that Dylan, presumed lost in the earlier chaos, might be reappearing with more stolen notes, and possibly with a splinter group of his own. The mere thought of Dylan's return added a volatile uncertainty to their already frayed nerves. His enigmatic presence had long been a source of both hope and dread, and the possibility of his comeback threatened to upend any fragile plans they'd begun to forge. With tensions at a fever pitch, the group was forced to divide their focus. Alice, Mark and Paul convened in a tight circle. Their expressions were grim as they resolved to secure the cure research at any cost. "If we get those notes back, we stand a chance at turning this virus around," Alice stated, her voice steady despite the tremor of fear beneath. They planned a daring mission to reclaim what was rightfully theirs, knowing that the information could be the only key to saving countless lives. Meanwhile, Sarah, ever the vigilant scout despite her recent injuries, volunteered to venture out into the perilous darkness. "I'll find any signs of Dylan or locate the rival faction's camp," she declared, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. The weight of responsibility was heavy on her, but her resolve shone through as she tightened her grip on a salvaged weapon. With a final determined nod from the others, Sarah slipped into the night, leaving behind mixed emotions that pulsed through the group like a heartbeat. In that fractured moment, as the night deepened and danger loomed on every side, the group steeled themselves for the next phase of their desperate journey. It was pre-dawn as Sarah stealthily crept away from the safety of the ravine, her footsteps muffled by fallen leaves and gravel. Guided by instinct and a desperate need for answers, she ventured deeper into the wilderness until she stumbled upon a concealed encampment hidden in the dense copse of trees. It was the rival faction, whose presence now loomed ominously over the group. It was gathered there in a makeshift camp. Tattered banners and crude symbols marked their territory, a territory that, as Sarah soon discovered, bore the unmistakable signature of Dylan's influence. Among scattered belongings and discarded documents, Sarah found a bundle of coded notes and intercepted messages. The scribbled lines revealed a meticulously orchestrated network of communications, all tracing back to Dylan. As she read, a cold dread settled in her stomach. These notes weren't just random orders for survival. No, they detailed a plan to seize control of the experimental cure and establish a new order, a monopoly over the future of humanity. Dylan's true motive was finally laid bare. He'd never been driven solely by a desperate instinct for survival, but rather by an insatiable hunger for power and control over life itself. With trembling hands, Sarah gathered as much evidence as she could before slipping back into the shadows. When she finally rejoined Alice, Mark and Paul in their hidden refuge within the ravine, the air was thick with tension. In hushed voices, she revealed the incriminating evidence. The group pored over the notes, their faces paling as they absorbed the magnitude of Dylan's betrayal. The realization hit them like a blow. Dylan intended to use the cure not as a means of salvation, but as a weapon to remake society in his own twisted image. The revelation intensified the moral stakes of everyone involved. No longer was their struggle merely about surviving the relentless onslaught of the undead and hostile factions. It had now become a battle for the soul of humanity. The group faced a wrenching choice: confront this external enemy that sought to control the cure, or reckon with the corrupting influence of power within their own ranks. In that fraught moment, as the first light of dawn began to pierce the darkness, they understood that the true enemy might not be the zombies outside, but the seductive allure of power and the moral compromises it demanded. The air outside the safe zone shattered into violence. Without warning, a brutal coordinated assault descended on them. That rival faction, drunk on the information they had and their twisted ambitions, launched a full-scale attack, just as a roaring tide of undead, drawn by the gunfire and the screams, crashed into the barricades. Flesh, bone, and steel collided in a savage frenzy. In that instant, the line between hope and oblivion disappeared. Inside the maelstrom, the battle exploded into a savage hand-to-hand combat. Alice, Mark, and Paul fought at the heart of the storm, every second a brutal struggle to survive. Bullets screamed past. Makeshift weapons clashed with a deafening clatter. Alice moved with ruthless precision, parrying blows and firing with steady hands, her heart hammering a relentless beat of survival. Mark, battered and bloodied, swung his weapon with a savage desperation, each strike a roar against the darkness pressing in. Paul, naturally trembling under the weight of illness and the enormity of his task, fought with a quiet, staggering courage, every breath a defiance against death. Through this chaos, Sarah surged forward like wildfire. With a cry of fury and defiance, she led a battered line of survivors into the fray, her weapon carving arcs of survival through the madness. Her voice rose above this carnage, a rallying cry that sparked embers of hope amongst the weary and wounded. Then, as the battle reached its breaking point, Paul made a devastating choice. Through the storm of gunfire and shrieks of the dying, he stumbled towards Alice and Mark, his face pale. His voice barely rose above the chaos. He would use the experimental cure on himself and on a few key allies. Well, this decision hung heavy in the smoke-thickened air. It was a gamble between salvation and utter ruin. While the medics scrambled to prepare the treatment in the middle of the blood-soaked battlefield, the enemy struck with renewed fury. From the heart of Dylan's splinter faction, a fanatical lieutenant emerged, a living embodiment of Dylan's twisted dream. His cold, dead eyes burned with conviction as he rallied his soldiers for one last merciless assault. The final clash was both savage and unrelenting. Fighters on both sides fell under desperate blows, their sacrifices staining the ground with the true cost of this brutal war. Explosions lit up the night, casting shadows over the carnage, and the undead poured through the breaches in the barricades, while the defenders, down to their last bullets, their last breaths, fought back with primal desperation. In the center of it all, Paul stood, the figure of humanity's fragile hope. The cure had begun to work, slowing the spread of the virus within him, giving him strength he hadn't felt in weeks. Around him a few others began to show the same resilience, a glimmer of salvation taking root amid the ruins. Every gunshot, every scream, every clash of iron against bone was a hammer blow against the fragile future they fought for. But the battle raged on, furious and unforgiving. Victory or annihilation would be carved from the blood-soaked earth, shaped by sacrifice, resilience, and the unbreakable will to rebuild a broken world. In the aftermath of the clash, the tide of the battle slowly began to ebb. Mark, battered and bloodied but unbroken, fought shoulder to shoulder with Sarah, driving back the last desperate remnants of Dylan's faction. Amid the wreckage of the fight, a dying Dylan, coughing blood and crumbling under his own wounds, revealed a final terrible secret, a concealed access door buried deep within the outpost's wreckage. Well, there was no time to hesitate. Following Dylan's faltering directions, the group stumbled into the hidden entrance, pushing through the gloom into a secret laboratory. Inside, the sterile coldness of the lab met them with rows of gleaming equipment and stacks of incriminating notes. What they found confirmed the unthinkable. Paul had once been at the heart of the experiments that had unleashed the virus. He was the architect of the very nightmare they'd fought so hard to survive. As the last echoes of the battle faded, the enemy's forces scattered to the wind. All eyes turned to Paul. He lay shivering and broken on a metal table, pale beneath the flickering fluorescent lights. Yet even now, he refused to surrender. With a voice barely more than a whisper, Paul again offered himself up. A slim, vanishing chance to undo the horror that he'd helped create. Tension crackled in the air like a live wire. Alice and Mark, driven by sheer willpower, forced their battered bodies into action. Alice calibrated the volatile equipment with trembling but precise hands. Mark worked alongside her, prepping vials, assembling syringes, his mind laser-focused despite the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. As ever, at the entrance, Sarah stood guard, her body swaying from the unseen wounds, but her eyes sharp and vigilant. In the distance, the groans of the undead thickened once more, drawn to the strange hum of the lab and the scent of living flesh. And so, this final procedure began, and agony exploded once again across Paul's body. He writhed against the restraints, his screams echoing off the cold walls. Alice's hands moved with desperate precision, adjusting doses, monitoring his failing vitals. Mark leaned in close, his voice steady and low, whispering encouragements that cut through the cacophony of alarms and Paul's hoarse cries. Oh, each moment stretched unbearably. Every second seemed like a battle against death itself. And outside, the sound of the horde grew louder, the relentless storm gathering at the threshold. While inside, the fragile hope of salvation flickered like a candle in a hurricane. As the final moments of Paul's procedure unfolded, his body spasmed violently before finally going still. For an agonizing few seconds, the group held their breath. Then, with a ragged gasp, Paul's eyes fluttered open. His skin, once marred by the sickly pallor of infection, had regained a hint of warmth. His breathing steadied. The cure, this time, had definitely worked. But at a cost. Before they could celebrate, a deafening boom rocked the lab. The tremors sent dust cascading from the ceiling as the last remnants of Dylan's faction detonated explosives near the outpost's foundation in a final act of vengeance. The entire structure groaned under the pressure, walls cracking as alarms blared. "We have to move now," Alice shouted. Supporting a dazed but stabilized Paul, they pushed forward, weaving through the crumbling underground tunnels toward the emergency exit that Dylan had revealed. Mark and Sarah held the rear, fending off the few remaining hostiles who'd refused to go down without a fight. But then came the final horror. As they neared the surface, the lead researcher of Dylan's splinter group, his second in command, a gaunt and fanatical man named Harlan, emerged from the shadows blocking their path. His face was twisted in righteous fury. "You think you've won?" Harlan spat, brandishing a vial of the modified virus. "You don't get to decide who survives. Dylan's vision, our vision, will live on. The strong will rise and the weak will be..." A single gunshot rang out. Sarah, bleeding and barely able to stand, had fired without hesitation. Harlan staggered, the vial slipping from his grasp. Time seemed to slow as it fell, the deadly pathogen it contained poised to shatter against the cold concrete. But Paul moved. Faster than seemed possible in his weakened state, he lunged, catching the vial mere inches from impact. He stood, shaking, the weight of their salvation balanced delicately in his palm. A moment of silence. Then the second explosion hit. Well, the force sent them all flying as the lab gave its final shuddering collapse. Dust and fire roared around them, and they scrambled through the emergency tunnel, the entire outpost caving in behind them. They emerged into the cold night, gasping, coughing, but alive. The once imposing safe zone was now reduced to burning rubble. Their long journey, all their sacrifices, it had all led to this moment. Paul, still clutching the vial, looked up at them. His voice was steady. "This is it. We have a cure for certain." But as the group took in their surroundings, their exhaustion finally catching up with them, a chilling realization sat in. The safe zone was gone. The scattered survivors were still out there. The world remained broken, chaotic, and lawless. And Dylan's ideology, well, that would never die so easily. As the first light of dawn touched the mountains, Alice looked at her battered, bloodied friends, the only family she had left. The road ahead was uncertain, and the war certainly wasn't over. But for the first time in a long time, a long, long time, there was hope. So yeah, that pretty much sums up my thinking of the world at the moment. Our worst enemies in the end will be us. We'll have to fight among ourselves for what we think is right. Anyway, getting a bit self-righteous here on this Sunday evening, but I think you know what I mean. Okay, so a good 2-hour story there. Hope you enjoyed that one. Yeah, I always love the post-apocalypse stuff, the zombie stuff, when you bring it all together. It's a lot of fun, and I used to think it was like pure fiction, nothing that could ever happen, but I'm getting older, the world's going a bit to places I don't want it to go, and well, I hope that isn't a prediction of the future. What do you think? Anyway, thoughts, feelings, anything else you want to say in the comment section below the video, and as ever, I will do my best to join in the conversation. Now, that is definitely enough for this Sunday evening. I'll be back again tomorrow with, another long story. I'm not quite sure what yet, but I'll be back tomorrow, so I do so hope you're going to join me. Till then, my dear friends, have a nice evening, lovely weekend, and I will see you again very, very soon. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.